The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the country club's grand ballroom. Crystal fragments scattered like tiny diamonds across the pristine surface, each piece reflecting the horrified faces of the wedding guests who had turned to stare. My son Marcus stood frozen 20 feet away, his new wife Victoria clinging to his arm with perfectly manicured nails, her expression a mixture of disgust and mortification that cut through me like a blade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mother, please, Marcus hissed, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. You're making a scene. Making a scene. Those 3 words echoed in my mind as I knelt to gather the broken glass, my hands shaking not from age but from the crushing weight of humiliation. At 62, I had survived the death of my husband, bankruptcy, and the slow erosion of my dignity. But nothing had prepared me for this moment, when my own son would treat me like a liability in front of 200 of the city's most influential people. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very hands now trembling over broken crystal had once been steady enough to perform complex surgeries, to save lives, to build the foundation that had given Marcus everything he'd ever wanted. But that was before the malpractice lawsuit that destroyed my medical practice, before the medical board's investigation that cleared me of wrongdoing but came too late to save my reputation, before I'd spent every penny I had fighting to prove my innocence. My name is Dr. Margaret Elena Hartwell, though most people had forgotten the doctor part over the past 3 years. I suppose I should start at the beginning, or at least at the beginning of the end. 5 years ago, I was one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in Seattle, with a practice that had taken me 30 years to build. My patients trusted me with their lives, my colleagues respected my expertise, and my son Marcus was proud to introduce me as his mother. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in October, when I lost a patient during what should have been a routine bypass surgery. Thomas Brennan was a 54-year-old father of 3 who came to me with blocked arteries and hope in his eyes. The surgery went perfectly, textbook even, but 12 hours later he coded in recovery. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't bring him back. What followed was a nightmare that lasted 2 years. The family, devastated and looking for someone to blame, filed a malpractice suit claiming I had been negligent during the procedure. They hired an expert witness who questioned every decision I'd made, every cut, every suture. The medical board launched their own investigation, and suddenly my entire career was under a microscope. The legal fees were astronomical. I mortgaged my house, liquidated my retirement accounts, and sold everything of value I owned to pay for the best legal defense I could find. Marcus, who was just starting his own investment firm at the time, couldn't help financially, and I wouldn't have asked him to. This was my battle to fight. After 18 months of depositions, expert testimonies, and sleepless nights, I was finally vindicated. The medical board found no evidence of negligence, and an independent review confirmed that Thomas Brennan had died from an undiagnosed genetic condition that would have killed him regardless of the surgery. But vindication came at a price. The stress of the investigation had aged me 10 years. The legal fees had bankrupted me, and the publicity had destroyed my reputation. Other doctors avoided me at conferences. Hospitals were reluctant to grant me privileges, and patients who had once sought me out now requested different surgeons. Within 6 months of my vindication, I was forced to close my practice. The house went into foreclosure, and I found myself moving into a modest apartment, in a neighborhood I'd never imagined calling home. Marcus had been supportive during the worst of it, visiting regularly and taking me to dinner when he could spare the time. But as my circumstances became more reduced and his business became more successful, our worlds began to drift apart. He started dating Victoria Pemberton, daughter of real estate mogul Harrison Pemberton, and suddenly his mother's reduced circumstances became an embarrassment rather than a temporary setback. The first hint of his changing attitude came at his engagement party last spring. Victoria had insisted on hosting it at her father's estate in Bellevue, a sprawling mansion that overlooked Lake Washington. I had worn my best dress, a navy blue, number that was 5 years old but still elegant, and arrived with a modest gift that had taken most of my monthly Social Security check to purchase. Victoria had greeted me with air kisses and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Margaret, how wonderful that you could make it," she'd said in that breathy, affected voice that made every word sound like she was speaking to a particularly slow child. "I just know you'll love meeting everyone. Though perhaps we should find you somewhere quiet to sit. These events can be so overwhelming." Overwhelming. As if I hadn't attended hundreds of similar gatherings throughout my career. As if I hadn't hosted my own elegant dinner parties for decades. But I'd smiled and let her guide me to a corner table where I spent the evening watching my son charm Victoria's family and friends while carefully avoiding bringing anyone over to meet me. The wedding planning had been even worse. Victoria had made it clear from the beginning that this would be her day, her vision, her guest list. When I'd offered to help with the costs, suggesting I could contribute what little I had toward the flowers or the reception, Victoria had actually laughed. "Oh, Margaret, that's so sweet of you to offer, but Daddy has everything covered. We really want this to be perfect, you understand. No compromises, no cutting corners. This is going to be the social event of the season." The implication was clear. My contribution wouldn't be significant enough to matter, and my involvement might somehow taint their perfect day. I was relegated to showing up, smiling, and staying out of the way. The rehearsal dinner had been held at the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Seattle, a place where a single entree cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. I'd worn the same navy dress from the engagement party, having no other option, and arrived to find myself seated at a table with Victoria's elderly great-aunt and a few distant cousins who clearly had no idea who I was. Marcus had made a speech that night about how grateful he was for all the support from family and friends as he and Victoria began their new life together. He'd thanked Victoria's parents for their generosity and guidance. He'd acknowledged his groomsmen and her bridesmaids. He'd even thanked the wedding planner. But when it came to mentioning his own mother, the woman who had raised him alone after his father died when he was 12, who had worked 70-hour weeks to pay for his education, who had sacrificed everything to give him the foundation for his success, he offered only a brief nod in my direction and a generic, "Thanks to all our family members who are here tonight." I'd excused myself to the restroom and cried for 10 minutes, wondering how my brilliant, compassionate son had become someone who was ashamed of where he came from. The wedding day had started early for me. I'd spent an hour getting ready in my small apartment, trying to make my limited wardrobe look appropriate for the occasion. The dress I'd chosen was a soft gray silk that I'd owned for 8 years, altered twice to fit my changing figure, and still elegant enough to pass muster. My jewelry was simple, just my wedding ring from my late husband and a pair of pearl earrings Marcus had given me for Mother's Day years ago. I'd taken the bus to the country club, unable to afford the taxi fare, and arrived to find the venue already bustling with activity. The wedding party was taking photos on the lawn, Victoria resplendent in a dress that probably cost more than I'd made in my last 6 months of substitute teaching at the local community college. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, I had to admit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria was stunning. Marcus looked handsome and happy, and the setting was undeniably elegant. I'd sat in the 3rd row, behind Victoria's family and close friends, watching my son promise to love and honor a woman who had made it clear she found his mother an embarrassment. During the cocktail hour, I'd tried to mingle, to be the gracious mother of the groom that I'd always imagined I'd be at my son's wedding. But every conversation felt forced. Every smile felt strained. Victoria's, Friends spoke in a language of designer names and vacation destinations that might as well have been foreign to me. When they asked what I did, and I mentioned my teaching work, they'd nod politely and find excuses to drift away. The reception had been in full swing for an hour when the champagne incident occurred. I'd been standing near the dance floor watching. Marcus and Victoria sway to their first dance as husband and wife when someone bumped into me from behind. The glass had simply slipped from my startled grasp, and suddenly I was on my knees in front of 200 guests, gathering broken crystal, while my son looked at me like I was a source of shame rather than the woman who had given him life. "I'm so sorry," I whispered to no one in particular as I carefully picked up the larger pieces. A server appeared with a dustpan and brush, efficiently cleaning up my mess while I stood there feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. "Perhaps you should sit down for a while." Victoria appeared beside me, her voice sweet as honey but her eyes cold as winter. "You look tired, and we wouldn't want another accident." Another accident. As if I was some clumsy old woman who couldn't be trusted around nice things, rather than a surgeon who had once repaired hearts with precision and confidence. I looked across the room and saw Marcus shaking his head slightly at someone who had started to approach, clearly signaling that now was not the time to engage with his embarrassing mother. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating to my assigned table in the corner, instead of making myself invisible as I'd been doing for months, I walked directly to the microphone that the DJ had been using to make announcements. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The room fell silent, 200 faces turning toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. I could see Victoria's face drain of color, could see Marcus start to move in my direction with panic in his eyes. "I'm Dr. Margaret Hartwell," I said, emphasizing the title that I'd earned through decades of study and practice. "The mother of the groom. I wanted to take a moment to share something with all of you about my son Marcus and his beautiful new wife Victoria." Marcus had stopped moving, frozen in the middle of the dance floor. Victoria looked like she might faint. But I wasn't finished. You see, Marcus has spent the last year telling Victoria and her family that I'm just a retired teacher, someone of modest means who lives a quiet life. And while it's true that I've faced some challenges in recent years, there are a few things he's forgotten to mention about his dear old mother. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build tension. In the audience, I spotted a familiar face, Dr. Robert Chen, the chief of cardiology at Seattle Medical Center. He was looking at me with recognition and what might have been respect. What Marcus hasn't told you is that before my retirement, I was one of the leading cardiothoracic surgeons on the West Coast. I performed over 3,000 successful heart surgeries, trained dozens of residents who now practice around the world, and pioneered techniques that are still being used today. A murmur went through the crowd. Dr. Chen was nodding now, and I could see other faces showing recognition. Seattle's medical community wasn't that large, and my reputation, while damaged, hadn't been entirely forgotten. He also hasn't mentioned that I paid for his entire education, from prep school through his MBA at Wharton, by working 100-hour weeks and taking every surgery I could get. Or that when he wanted to start his investment firm, I mortgaged my house to help him with the initial capital. Marcus's face had gone from pale to red. Victoria was gripping his arm so tightly I could see her knuckles turning white. But I still wasn't finished. Most importantly, he hasn't told you about the phone call I received this morning. This was my moment, the revelation that would change everything. I reached into my small purse and pulled out my phone, holding it up, so everyone could see. This morning, I received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the head of Médecins Sans Frontières cardiac surgery program. It seems they've been trying to reach me for months to offer me the position of chief surgical consultant for their new pediatric heart surgery center in Costa Rica. The silence in the room was absolute now. Every person was hanging on my words, including my son and his new wife, who were both staring at me with expressions of shock. They're offering me a salary of $200,000 a year, plus housing, plus a signing bonus of $50,000. They want me to help them build a program that will save hundreds of children's lives. I looked directly at Marcus now, seeing him fully for perhaps the first time in years. They found me through Dr. Chen here, who recommended me despite knowing about my recent difficulties. Because you see, Marcus, some people remember who I really am, even when my own son has chosen to forget. Dr. Chen stood up from his table, raising his wine glass. Ladies and gentlemen, I can confirm that Dr. Margaret Hartwell is one of the most skilled surgeons I've ever had the privilege to work with. Any organization would be lucky to have her expertise. A few other doctors in the crowd began to murmur agreement. Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital stood as well. Dr. Hartwell saved my daughter's life when she was born with a complex heart defect. I've been wondering where you disappeared to, Margaret. The tide was turning. The woman they'd all seen as Marcus's embarrassing, poverty-stricken mother was being revealed as someone with credentials and respect they hadn't imagined. Victoria's father, Harrison Pemberton, was looking at me with new interest, probably calculating what connections to the medical community might mean for his business dealings. But here's the thing, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. When Dr. Morrison called this morning, she mentioned something interesting. She said they'd been trying to reach me through my family, but that my son had told them I was unavailable for international positions due to health concerns. Marcus's mouth fell open. He'd been intercepting calls about my professional opportunities, just as he'd been managing my life to fit his narrative of what he wanted me to be. So you see, dear guests, my son hasn't just been embarrassed by me. He's been actively sabotaging my chances at rebuilding my career because it was easier to have a dependent mother than a successful one. The crowd was buzzing now, conversations breaking out at tables as people processed what they'd just heard. Victoria was whispering furiously in Marcus's ear, probably calculating how this revelation would affect their social standing. But I had one more card to play, one that would ensure my son never underestimated me again. Which brings me to my wedding gift, I said, reaching into my purse again. This time I pulled out an envelope, holding it up for everyone to see. When Marcus started his investment firm, I gave him $50,000 from my retirement savings. Money I'd planned to use for my own future, but money I gave freely because I believed in my son's dreams. Marcus was shaking his head now, probably realizing where this was going. That $50,000, invested in Marcus's firm, has grown considerably over the past 5 years. In fact, as of this morning, my investment portfolio with Wallace Investment Group is worth just over $800,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Victoria's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Her father was staring at me with undisguised interest now. $800,000 was real money, even in their circles. Marcus has been managing my investments, taking his standard fees, but never once mentioning to me how well my portfolio was performing. In fact, when I asked about possibly withdrawing some funds to help with my living expenses, he told me that my investments were barely breaking even and that I should leave everything alone for my own financial security. The implications were staggering. My son had been keeping me in poverty while managing my money, which had grown into a substantial fortune. He'd been lying to me about my own financial situation while watching me struggle to pay for groceries. So my wedding gift to you, Marcus and Victoria, is this. I held up the envelope. These are the papers transferring my entire investment portfolio out of Wallace Investment Group and into my personal control. Effective Monday morning, I'll be taking my $800,000 and using it to fund my new position with Médecins Sans Frontières. Marcus finally found his voice. Mother, you can't be serious. That money needs professional management. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly, I cut him off. I understand that my son has been keeping me dependent and impoverished while profiting from my money and blocking my professional opportunities. I understand that you've been lying to me, lying about me, and treating me like an embarrassment when I should have been your pride. Victoria stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. Now wait just a minute. Marcus has been taking care of you, providing for you. Providing for me? I laughed, the sound echoing through the microphone. Victoria, darling, I've been living on $800 a month in Social Security while my son managed my portfolio worth nearly $1 million. If that's his idea of taking care of me, I'd hate to see what neglect looks like. The crowd was completely engaged now, witnessing a family drama that was better than any soap opera. But more than that, they were seeing a woman reclaim her power, her dignity, and her life. Dr. Morrison had been right when she'd called that morning. The opportunity in Costa Rica was real, the salary was substantial, and the work would be meaningful. What she hadn't mentioned in our brief conversation was that my reputation in international medical circles was actually stronger than it had ever been domestically. The malpractice lawsuit that had destroyed my practice in Seattle was seen by my international colleagues as exactly what it was, a frivolous suit by a grieving family looking for someone to blame. I leave for Costa Rica in 3 weeks, I announced to the room. I'll be spending the next 2 years helping to build a pediatric cardiac surgery program that will serve children throughout Central America. It's work that matters, work that will save lives, and work that pays me what I'm actually worth. I looked at Marcus one last time, seeing him not as the successful businessman he'd become, but as the 12-year-old boy who had cried in my arms when his father died, who had needed me to be strong for both of us. I raised you to be better than this, Marcus. I raised you to value character over social standing, to treat people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, and to never forget where you came from. Somewhere along the way, you lost sight of those values. I turned to Victoria, who was still clutching my son's arm like a lifeline. And Victoria, you married a man who would choose social acceptance over loyalty to the woman who gave him life. I hope that works out better for you than it has for me. With that, I stepped away from the microphone and walked toward the exit, my head held high for the first time in years. Behind me, I could hear the eruption of conversation, the buzz of 200 people trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Dr. Chen intercepted me at the door. Margaret, that was magnificent, and I meant what I said about your reputation. If you ever decide to come back to Seattle, my department would welcome you with open arms. Dr. Williams joined us, pressing her business card into my hand. I mean it about my daughter. She's 18 now, studying pre-med because she wants to help children the way you helped her. She'd love to meet you before you leave for Costa Rica. As I walked out into the cool Seattle evening, I realized that I'd spent the last 3 years thinking I'd lost everything. My career, my reputation, my financial security, my relationship with my son. But tonight had shown me that I'd only lost the things that weren't truly mine to begin with. My skills were still intact. My knowledge was still valuable. My compassion was still strong. And my ability to save lives was still needed, just in a different place and in a different way. The bus ride home gave me time to think about what came next. In 3 weeks, I'd be boarding a plane to San Jose, Costa Rica, where a new chapter of my life would begin. I'd be working with children who needed me, training local doctors in advanced surgical techniques, and building something meaningful with my remaining years. But first, I had some preparations to make. The portfolio transfer would happen on Monday, despite whatever legal objections Marcus might try to raise. My apartment lease ended at the end of the month anyway, so giving notice would be simple. And I had some shopping to do, professional wardrobe pieces that would be appropriate for my new position. More importantly, I had some calls to make. Dr. Morrison was expecting my formal acceptance of the position by Monday. Dr. Chen had offered to write a recommendation letter, and there were several former colleagues who had been trying to reach me over the years, people who had never believed the worst of me and who might be helpful as I transitioned back into international medicine. As the bus pulled up to my stop, I looked at my reflection in the window and saw something I hadn't seen in years. I saw Dr. Margaret Hartwell, not the diminished, embarrassed woman I'd become, but the confident, capable surgeon I'd always been. Underneath the circumstances that had tried to define me, tomorrow would bring the aftermath of tonight's revelations. Marcus would probably try to contact me, either to apologize or to try to convince me I was making a mistake. Victoria would likely be calculating how to minimize the social damage from having her wedding disrupted by her mother-in-law's dramatic revelation. And the Seattle social scene would be buzzing with gossip about the wedding where the groom's mother turned out to be far more than anyone had expected. But tonight, I was just going to sit in my small apartment, drink a glass of wine, and plan for the future I should have embraced years ago. A future where my worth wasn't determined by my son's approval or my financial circumstances, but by my ability to use my skills and experience to make a difference in the world. The woman who had knelt to pick up broken glass at her son's wedding was gone. In her place was Dr. Margaret Hartwell, and she had work to do. The phone started ringing at 6:30 Monday morning, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to Marcus's voice, strained and desperate, asking me to call him back immediately. By the time I'd finished my morning coffee, there were 7 more messages, each one more frantic than the last. I was in no hurry to return his calls. Instead, I dressed carefully in my best business suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that had served me well during my medical career, and prepared for what I knew would be a pivotal day. The portfolio transfer was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Meridian Bank, and I had an appointment with my new attorney at 11:30. Yes, I'd hired an attorney. Harold Peterson came highly recommended by Dr. Chen, and our preliminary conversation on Sunday had confirmed what I'd suspected. Marcus's management of my investments, while technically legal since I'd given him power of attorney, had involved several questionable decisions that prioritized his firm's profit margins over my financial well-being. The taxi dropped me off at the imposing glass tower that housed Meridian Bank's investment division. I'd chosen them specifically because they were competitors to Marcus's firm, and because their reputation for discretion meant my business wouldn't become fodder for Seattle's financial gossip mill. Patricia Reynolds, my new investment advisor, greeted me with the kind of professional respect I hadn't experienced in years. She was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that assessed me carefully as we shook hands. "Dr. Hartwell, it's an honor to meet you. I've reviewed the portfolio documents you sent over, and I have to say, your son's firm has done well with your investments, even if their communication with you has been lacking." Lacking was a diplomatic way to put it. As we settled into her corner office overlooking Elliott Bay, Patricia spread out the financial statements that told the story of my money's journey over the past 5 years. "Your initial investment of $50,000 has indeed grown to $812,000 as of Friday's close," she confirmed. "However, the fees charged by Wallace Investment Group have been significantly higher than industry standard. Over 5 years, you've paid approximately $60,000 more in management fees than you would have with our standard portfolio management." $60,000. Enough to have kept me comfortable for 3 years instead of struggling in poverty. My son hadn't just hidden my wealth from me. He'd been systematically overcharging me while I counted pennies for groceries. "There's something else," Patricia continued, her expression growing more serious. "The investment strategy used for your portfolio has been extremely conservative, much more so than would typically be recommended for someone with your risk tolerance and timeline. A more appropriate strategy could have yielded returns of over $1.2 million. I absorbed this information quietly, feeling a cold fury building in my chest. Marcus hadn't just kept me in the dark about my finances. He'd actively managed my money in a way that benefited his firm rather than my future. What I'd like to propose, Patricia said, pulling out a leather portfolio, is a complete restructuring of your investments to align with your new circumstances and goals. With your position in Costa Rica confirmed, we can create a diversified portfolio that will not only preserve your wealth, but help it grow substantially over the next decade. We spent the next hour going through the details. International investments that would provide income while I was overseas, growth stocks that aligned with my risk tolerance, and a strategy that would ensure I'd never again be dependent on anyone else's financial decisions. As I signed the transfer documents, my phone buzzed with yet another call from Marcus. I declined it and turned my attention back to Patricia, who was explaining the electronic banking setup that would allow me to manage my accounts from anywhere in the world. By the time I left the bank, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of financial uncertainty, of dependence, of having to justify every purchase had lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer a burden or an embarrassment. I was a woman of means making her own choices about her future. Harold Peterson's law office occupied the top floor of a historic building in Pioneer Square. Harold himself was a bear of a man with wild gray hair and a reputation for taking on cases that others considered unwinnable. His office walls were covered with newspaper clippings documenting his victories against corporate malfeasance and family exploitation. "Dr. Hartwell," he boomed, rising from behind a desk that looked like it had survived several decades of legal battles. "Robert Chen speaks very highly of you, says you're the best surgeon he's ever worked with and that your son is an ungrateful fool." I couldn't help but smile at his directness. Dr. Chen has always been generous with his praise. I'm here because I need to understand my legal options regarding my son's management of my financial affairs. Harold gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "I've reviewed the documents you sent over, and I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that since you gave him power of attorney voluntarily, there's no criminal fraud here. The good news is that we can make a very strong case for breach of fiduciary duty." He explained that as my investment manager, Marcus had been legally obligated to act in my best interests, not his firm's. The excessive fees, conservative investment strategy, and failure to communicate my financial position could all be considered violations of that duty. More importantly, Harold continued, leaning back in his chair, his interference with your professional opportunities could constitute intentional interference with prospective economic advantage. If we can prove he deliberately blocked job offers or professional connections, that's grounds for a civil suit. I thought about Dr. Morrison's mention of trying to reach me through family channels, about the other opportunities that might have been intercepted over the years. "What kind of damages could we be looking at?" I asked. Harold's grin was predatory. "Conservative estimate? The $60,000 in excessive fees, plus the $400,000 difference between your actual returns and what you should have earned with proper management. Add in punitive damages for the breach of fiduciary duty, and we're looking at close to $1 million. $1 million. The number was staggering, but more than the money, it represented accountability. Marcus would have to face the consequences of treating me like a burden instead of his mother. "There's one more thing," Harold said, his expression growing more serious. "I did some checking on your son's firm. They're in the middle of negotiations for a major merger with Pemberton Financial Holdings, Harrison Pemberton's company. Victoria's father was planning to merge with Marcus's firm, which explained the urgency behind the wedding and Victoria's insistence on everything being perfect. A lawsuit alleging financial elder abuse against the firm's founder would definitely complicate those merger negotiations," Harold observed. "Might even kill the deal entirely if Pemberton gets nervous about liability issues." The implications were enormous. Marcus wasn't just facing personal consequences. His entire business future was at stake. Part of me felt a maternal instinct to protect him, but a larger part remembered the humiliation at the wedding, The years of being treated like an embarrassment. The deliberate sabotage of my opportunities. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Harold leaned forward, his eyes serious. "I recommend we file the suit this week before you leave for Costa Rica. Discovery alone will force them to produce records showing exactly how your money was managed and what opportunities were intercepted. Even if they want to settle, it puts you in a position of strength." We spent another hour going through the details of the legal strategy. Harold would handle everything while I was overseas, keeping me informed through secure email and video calls. The suit would be filed under seal initially to allow Marcus a chance to respond privately, but if he chose to fight rather than settle, it would become public record. As I prepared to leave, Harold handed me a business card for his colleague in San Jose. "Just in case you need legal representation in Costa Rica. International medical work can sometimes involve complex liability issues." The thoroughness of his preparation impressed me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had someone genuinely looking out for my interests rather than managing me for their own convenience. The taxi ride back to my apartment gave me time to think about the conversation I'd been avoiding all day. Eventually, I would have to speak with Marcus. Not because I owed him an explanation, but because, despite everything, he was still my son. The apartment felt different when I walked in, as if the financial freedom I'd secured that morning had somehow changed the very air. The modest furniture and secondhand decorations that had felt shabby just days ago now seemed like temporary arrangements rather than permanent fixtures of reduced circumstances. I poured myself a glass of wine and finally returned Marcus's call. He answered before the first ring finished. "Mother, thank God. We need to talk immediately. What you did Saturday night has created serious problems that we need to resolve. Not an apology, not concern for my well-being, just problems that needed to be resolved." "Hello, Marcus," I said calmly. "I assume you're referring to my decision to reclaim control of my own financial affairs." "You can't just transfer that portfolio without consultation," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Those investments require sophisticated management. You don't understand the tax implications, the market complexities." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "I understand that you've been charging me excessive fees while keeping me in poverty. I understand that you've been lying to me about my financial position for years. And I understand that you've been intercepting professional opportunities to keep me dependent." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Marcus spoke again, his tone had shifted from frustrated to calculated. "Mother, I think you may have gotten some bad advice from someone who doesn't understand the full situation. Yes, I've been conservative with your investments, but that's because I was trying to protect your future. After what happened with the malpractice suit, I didn't want you to risk losing everything again." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind that might have convinced me even a week ago. But sitting in my apartment with the portfolio transfer, documents on my coffee table and Harold Peterson's legal strategy fresh in my mind, I could hear the manipulation underneath the concern. "Marcus, I spoke with my new investment advisor today. She showed me exactly how my money should have been managed and what returns I should have seen. Your protection cost me over $400,000 in lost growth." "That's hindsight. Analysis," he protested. "No one could have predicted those market movements with certainty. I made the best decisions I could with the information available at the time." "And what about the job opportunities? What about Dr. Morrison's attempts to reach me through you?" Another pause, longer this time. "I may have been overly protective about those contacts. But Mother, you have to understand, some of these international positions are scams. People prey on doctors who are having financial difficulties. I was trying to protect you from making a mistake that could have been catastrophic." The patronizing tone was exactly what I'd expected, but hearing it confirmed everything I'd realized about how my son truly saw me. Not as a capable professional who could evaluate opportunities for herself, but as a vulnerable elderly woman who needed his protection from her own poor judgment. Marcus, I've accepted the position with Médecins Sans Frontières. I leave for Costa Rica in 3 weeks. You can't be serious. His voice rose sharply. Mother, you're 62 years old. You haven't practiced surgery in 3 years. International medicine is completely different from what you're used to. You could get sick, injured, or worse. And for what? To prove some point about your independence? To do meaningful work and earn what I'm actually worth, I replied evenly. To use my skills to help children who need them. To rebuild a career. That was never actually over, just interrupted. This is insane, Marcus said, his professional composure finally cracking entirely. You're throwing away your security, your family relationships, everything stable in your life to chase some fantasy about being important again. There it was, the truth underneath all his concerns about my safety and welfare. Marcus didn't think I could be important again. He'd accepted his mother's diminished status as permanent and built his new life around managing my limitations rather than supporting my potential. I've hired an attorney, Marcus. The words hung in the air like a dropped bomb. I could practically hear him calculating the implications, trying to figure out how much I knew and what legal exposure he might be facing. An attorney for what? His voice was carefully controlled now. To review how you've managed my financial affairs over the past 5 years. Harold Peterson is quite knowledgeable about fiduciary duty violations. Harold Peterson? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Mother, that man is a shark. He specializes in destroying people's reputations and livelihoods. You can't trust anything. He tells you. He specializes in holding people accountable for their actions, I corrected. Something that's apparently long overdue in our family. This is Victoria, isn't it? Marcus's tone shifted to something approaching desperation. She's upset about Saturday night, about the disruption to our wedding. But we can work through that. Families have disagreements all the time. I almost laughed at his attempt to blame his wife for consequences that were entirely his own making. Victoria didn't intercept my job opportunities, Marcus. Victoria didn't lie to me about my financial situation for 3 years. Victoria didn't treat me like an embarrassment while profiting from my money. I never treated you like an embarrassment, he protested, but the denial sounded hollow even to him. You literally told people I was unavailable for professional positions due to health concerns. You seated me with strangers at your wedding while giving a speech that barely acknowledged my existence. You've been managing my life to fit your narrative instead of supporting the person I actually am. The conversation was taking an emotional toll on both of us. I could hear the strain in Marcus's voice, could imagine him in his expensive office overlooking Lake Union, trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his management. What do you want from me? He asked finally. What would it take to resolve this without lawyers and lawsuits and destroying our relationship permanently? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since Saturday night. What did I want from my son besides acknowledgement of what he'd done wrong? I want you to understand who I am, I said slowly. Not who you think I should be or who it's convenient for me to be, but who I actually am. I'm Dr. Margaret Hartwell. I'm a skilled surgeon with decades of experience. I'm a woman capable of making my own decisions about my career, my finances, and my future. And I'm your mother, which should mean something more than being a problem to be managed. Of course you're my mother, Marcus said, his voice softening, slightly. That's why I've been trying to protect you. Everything I did was because I love you and I didn't want to see you hurt again. Protection that requires deception isn't love, Marcus. It's control. And I'm done being controlled by anyone, even with the best of intentions. The conversation ended without resolution, as I'd expected it would. Marcus promised to call again soon, after he'd had time to think about everything I'd said. I suspected, His next move would be to consult with his own attorney about how to minimize his legal exposure. But that was his problem to solve. I had packing to do. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. I visited my doctor for the required international health clearances, updated my passport, and arranged for storage of the few belongings I wanted to keep. Most of my furniture would go to charity. I was traveling light to my new life. Dr. Morrison called on Wednesday with additional details about the Costa Rica position. The Pediatric Heart Surgery Center was being built in partnership with San Jose's main public hospital, serving not just Costa Rica, but children from throughout Central America whose families couldn't afford private treatment. "We're particularly excited about your background with complex congenital repairs," Dr. Morrison explained during our video call. "That's exactly the expertise we need to make this program successful." She walked me through the facility plans, showed me photos of the team I'd be working with, and discussed the training component of my role. I'd be working with local surgeons and visiting fellows from other Latin American countries, sharing techniques and building sustainable expertise that would outlast my 2-year commitment. "There's one more thing," Dr. Morrison said toward the end of our call. "The position comes with an option to extend indefinitely if you're happy with the work and we're happy with your performance. Several of our consultants have ended up staying, much longer than their initial commitments." The possibility of making this more than a temporary assignment was appealing. Costa Rica offered universal health care, a stable democracy, and a culture that valued both family and professional achievement. It could be a place where I could rebuild not just my career, but my entire life. On Thursday, Victoria called. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on my phone screen, but curiosity won out over avoidance. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling directly." Victoria's voice was carefully modulated, the same tone she probably used for difficult business negotiations. "I wanted to speak with you about Saturday night and everything that's happened since." "Of course," I said, settling into my chair and preparing for whatever approach she'd decided to take. "First, I want to apologize for any way that I might have made you feel unwelcome or undervalued," she began. "That was never my intention, and I'm truly sorry if my actions contributed to your discomfort." It was a skillfully worded apology that managed to express regret without actually accepting responsibility for anything specific. Classic corporate damage control. "I appreciate that, Victoria," I replied neutrally. "The thing is," she continued, "Marcus is devastated by what's happened between you two. He loves you deeply, and he's terrified that he's lost you forever. The legal situation is just making everything worse." So Marcus had told her about Harold Peterson and the potential lawsuit. I wondered if he'd also told her about the merger with her father's company and how my legal action could affect their business plans. "Marcus is an adult, Victoria. He's responsible for the consequences of his own choices. But surely there's some way to work this out within the family," she pressed. "Lawyers and lawsuits, they just create more problems and hurt feelings. They don't actually solve anything." "They solve the problem of accountability," I said firmly. "For 3 years, I've been treated like a burden and a responsibility instead of a person with value. That needs to change." "Of course you have value," Victoria said quickly. "Your medical background is incredible, and what you're doing in Costa Rica sounds amazing. I had no idea about your accomplishments when we first met." Because Marcus had never told her. He'd been so busy managing my image to fit his narrative that he'd never shared anything that might make her see me as impressive rather than pitiable. "Victoria, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Did Marcus ever tell you that I paid for his education? That I helped fund his business? That I gave up my house and my retirement savings to support his dreams?" The pause was long enough to be an answer in itself. "He mentioned that you'd been supportive over the years," she said finally. Supportive. As if my sacrifices had been casual gestures rather than the foundation that made his success possible. Did he tell you that I was managing nearly $1 million in investments while living on $800 a month? Another pause. Margaret, I think there may be some misunderstandings about the financial arrangements. There are no misunderstandings, I interrupted. There are just facts that Marcus chose not to share because they didn't fit the story he wanted to tell about his embarrassing, dependent mother. He doesn't think you're embarrassing, Victoria protested, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Victoria, I need you to understand something. This isn't about money or legal action or even about my relationship with Marcus. This is about dignity. About being seen as a whole person rather than a problem to be managed. About having my choices and capabilities respected rather than overruled by someone who thinks they know what's best for me. I understand that, she said, and for the first time, her voice sounded genuinely thoughtful rather than calculated. I just worry that going to Costa Rica, especially with everything unresolved here, might not be the fresh start you're hoping for. Why is that? Because you'll still be carrying all this anger and hurt with you. You'll still be defining yourself in opposition to Marcus rather than simply as who you are. That's not really freedom, is it? It was a surprisingly insightful observation, one that suggested Victoria might be more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe the real victory isn't proving Marcus wrong or making him pay for his mistakes. Maybe it's just living your life so fully and successfully that his opinion becomes irrelevant. There was wisdom in what she was saying, but also a convenient overlooking of justice. Marcus's actions had real consequences that went beyond hurt feelings. The money he'd cost me, the opportunities he'd blocked, the years he'd kept me small. Those weren't things that could be resolved simply by my becoming successful elsewhere. I appreciate your perspective, Victoria, but some things require accountability before they can be forgiven. And if Marcus provides that accountability, if he acknowledges what he did wrong and tries to make it right, then we'll see what happens next, I said honestly. But the acknowledgement has to be real, not just words designed to make the legal problems go away. After Victoria hung up, I found myself wondering if Marcus had sent her to call me or if she'd made the decision on her own. Either way, her approach had been more thoughtful than her husband's defensive protests. But it didn't change the fundamental equation. I was leaving for Costa Rica in 10 days, with or without resolution to the family crisis. My new life was waiting, and I wasn't going to postpone it for the convenience of people who had spent years postponing my needs for theirs. The weekend brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Williams arrived at my apartment Saturday morning with her daughter Sarah, the young woman whose life I'd saved 18 years ago. Sarah was beautiful, with her mother's intelligent eyes and a confidence that spoke of someone who had never taken her health for granted. She was finishing her senior year at the University of Washington, preparing for medical school, and hoping to specialize in pediatric cardiology. Dr. Hartwell, she said, taking my hands in hers, I've wanted to thank you my entire life. Mom has told me the story 100 times about how you spent 14 hours rebuilding my heart when I was just a baby. We spent the morning looking through photo albums Patricia had brought, documenting Sarah's childhood and achievements. Academic awards, athletic accomplishments, volunteer work with children's charities. A full, vibrant life that might never have existed without that 14-hour surgery. I have a favor to ask, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. Would you be willing to write me a recommendation letter for medical school? I know it's presumptuous, but having a letter from the surgeon who saved my life would mean everything to me. I agreed immediately, touched that she would want my recommendation despite my recent professional difficulties. That afternoon, I wrote what might have been the most heartfelt recommendation letter of my career, describing not just Sarah's qualifications, but the privilege of watching a life I'd helped save bloom into such purpose and promise. As I sealed the letter that evening, I realized that this was why I was going to Costa Rica. Not to prove anything to Marcus or Victoria or Seattle's medical community, but to have more moments like this, to save more children, to train more. Doctors, to be part of something larger than family drama and financial disputes. My phone rang as I was preparing for bed. It was Marcus again, but this time his voice was different. Quieter, less defensive, more like the son I remembered. Mother, I've been thinking about everything you said, about everything that's happened, and I think I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. I waited, letting him find his words. You're right, about all of it. I have been treating you like an embarrassment, like a problem to be managed instead of my mother who sacrificed everything for me. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself from having to acknowledge how much I owe you. It was the beginning of the conversation I'd been waiting 3 years to have, but whether it would lead to real change or just more sophisticated manipulation remained to be seen. The rest of that conversation and what it would mean for our future relationship would determine not just how I left Seattle, but what kind of peace I could carry with me to Costa Rica. Marcus arrived at my apartment the following evening, looking more disheveled than I'd seen him since his father's funeral. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he seemed to take in the modest surroundings with new eyes. The furniture that had always been beneath his notice, the small kitchen where I'd been, carefully budgeting meals, the stack of medical journals I'd continued subscribing to despite the cost, because they represented my connection to the profession I loved. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, falling back on the maternal instincts that ran deeper than anger. He nodded gratefully, settling onto my worn couch while I prepared 2 cups. When I returned, he was holding the framed photograph that sat on my side table, the one from his medical school graduation where we stood together, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. "I remember this day," he said quietly. "You were so proud of me for getting into the residency program at Johns Hopkins. You kept introducing me to everyone as my son, the future investment banker. You changed your mind about medicine 3 months into residency," I reminded him, settling into the chair across from him. "Said you realized you wanted to help people build wealth instead of just fixing their health problems. And you supported that decision completely, even though you'd dreamed of us working together someday." He set the photograph down carefully. "You never once made me feel guilty about walking away from medicine, even after everything you'd invested in my education." "It was your life to choose," I said simply. "I wanted you to be happy, not to live out my dreams." Marcus stared into his coffee cup for a long moment before looking up at me. "I need to tell you something about Victoria's father and the merger." I waited, sensing this was important. The deal isn't just about combining our companies. Pemberton has been looking for a way to legitimize his business practices. His real estate empire was built on some questionable tactics, and associating with my firm was supposed to give him credibility in financial circles. And now he's concerned about associating with someone facing a lawsuit for elder financial abuse, I observed. More than concerned. He's threatening to pull out entirely unless I can resolve this situation quickly and quietly. Marcus looked up at me, his expression raw with vulnerability. "Victoria's furious with me, not because of the money or the business deal, but because she says I turned her into someone she doesn't recognize." "How so?" "She said watching me dismiss you at the wedding made her realize she'd been doing the same thing. That she'd become the kind of person who judges others based on their financial circumstances instead of their character." He ran his hands through his hair. "She's been volunteering at Seattle Children's Hospital since Tuesday, working with families who can't afford their medical bills." This was an unexpected development. Victoria's transformation from social climber to volunteer advocate seemed as dramatic as my own journey from dependent mother to international surgeon. "What else?" I asked, sensing there was more. I called Dr. Morrison personally to apologize for interfering with her attempts to contact you. She was very polite, but she made it clear that obstructing professional opportunities for family members is considered highly unethical in international medical circles. The implications of that conversation were significant. Marcus's interference hadn't just affected me. It had potentially damaged his own reputation in circles that might matter for his business dealings. "There's something else," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I looked at your medical records from the malpractice case. Really looked at them, not just the summary the lawyers provided." I tensed, unsure where this was heading. Mother, what happened to Thomas Brennan wasn't just a genetic condition. It was an incredibly rare variant that only a dozen cases had ever been documented. The fact that you even suspected it during surgery and tried to compensate, for it shows surgical instincts that most doctors couldn't match. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I read the expert testimonies from your defense. Dr. Elizabeth Harding from Stanford called your surgical technique flawless. Dr. James Morrison said your diagnostic instincts were among the finest he'd encountered in 30 years of practice." "That's what Dr. Morrison said," I agreed carefully. "Dr. James Morrison, the head of pediatric cardiac surgery at Stanford, who happens to be married to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the woman who offered you the Costa Rica position." The connection I hadn't made suddenly became clear. The Morrison couple were both renowned cardiac surgeons, and their recommendation carried weight throughout the international medical community. "They've been tracking your case for 3 years, Marcus continued, waiting for you to be ready to return to practice. The Costa Rica position wasn't just an opportunity that came up, it was specifically designed for you." I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. While I'd been struggling with self-doubt and financial hardship, some of the most respected surgeons in the world had been watching, waiting, believing in my eventual return to medicine. "How did you find all this out?" I asked. "I hired a Tawam private investigator to research your professional reputation, thinking I could find evidence that taking the Costa Rica job was a mistake." His laugh was bitter. "Instead, I found out that my mother is considered one of the finest cardiac surgeons of her generation, and that turning down this opportunity would be professionally insane." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of these revelations settling between us. Marcus had set out to prove I was making a mistake, and instead discovered that he was the one who had been wrong about everything. "I've already spoken with Harold Peterson," he said finally. "I want to settle the lawsuit and make full restitution for the excessive fees and lost investment returns. And I want to establish a medical education fund in your name at the University of Washington. Something that will help students from modest backgrounds afford medical school, the way you helped me afford everything I ever wanted." It was a generous gesture, but I sensed there was more. "There's one more thing I need to ask you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to come to Costa Rica with you." I stared at him in shock. "What?" "Not to work, not to interfere with your position, but to see what you're going to be doing, to understand the work that matters to you, to spend time with my mother before she becomes too important and busy to need her son anymore." The request was so unexpected, so different from anything I'd imagined, that I found myself speechless. "I know I don't deserve it," he continued. "I know I've forfeited any right to be part of your success after trying so hard to limit it. But Victoria pointed out something that I hadn't considered. Which is? That maybe the reason I've been so controlling is because I've been terrified of losing you. Dad died when I was 12, and you became everything to me. Provider, protector, mentor, cheerleader. When you started struggling after the lawsuit, I panicked. I thought if I could just manage everything perfectly, I could keep you safe and keep you mine." It was the most honest thing my son had said to me in years, and it explained so much about his behavior that I'd attributed to embarrassment or financial greed. "But what I did instead was push you away," he continued. I made you smaller in my life instead of finding ways to grow with you. And now you're about to become larger than life again. And I'm terrified I've lost my chance to be part of it. I looked at this man who was my son, seeing both the successful businessman he'd become and the frightened 12-year-old boy who had cried in my arms when his father died. For 3 years, I'd been focusing on what Marcus had taken from me, but I'd forgotten what he might have been afraid of losing. The Costa Rica position is for 2 years, I said slowly, with an option to extend indefinitely. I know. The work will be demanding. Long hours, complex cases, training responsibilities. I understand. And I won't be the dependent mother you're used to managing. I'll be Dr. Margaret Hartwell, Chief Surgical Consultant, with my own life and my own priorities. That's what I'm hoping to get to know, he said softly. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. Dr. Morrison's name appeared on the screen, and I motioned for Marcus to wait while I answered. Margaret, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to give you an update on some exciting developments. Of course, what's happening? We've just received approval for an additional funding stream that will allow us to expand the program beyond our initial projections. Instead of serving just Costa Rica and the immediate region, we'll be able to accept patients from throughout Latin America. The scope of the opportunity was growing even larger than I'd imagined. More importantly, Dr. Morrison continued, we've been asked to document our methods and outcomes for potential replication in other developing regions. The work you do in Costa Rica could become a model for pediatric cardiac surgery programs worldwide. I felt a familiar thrill, the same excitement I'd experienced early in my career, when groundbreaking work felt possible. This wasn't just about returning to medicine, it was about helping to reshape how complex cardiac care could be delivered in resource-limited settings. There's one more thing, Dr. Morrison said. The expanded program will require additional expertise in medical education and program development. If you know of any qualified administrators with international experience, we'd be interested in speaking with them. I looked at Marcus, who had been listening intently to my side of the conversation. His background in finance and business development, combined with his personal understanding of my work, might actually make him valuable to the program in ways I hadn't considered. I might have some suggestions, I told Dr. Morrison. Can I get back to you tomorrow? After ending the call, I turned back to Marcus. The program is expanding significantly. They're going to need administrative support for the business side of operations. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe your request to come to Costa Rica isn't as impractical as I initially thought. If you're serious about understanding my work and making amends for what you've done, there might be a way for you to contribute meaningfully to the program. Marcus's eyes lit up with possibility. You'd really consider that? After everything? I'd consider it, I said carefully, but there would be conditions. Name them. First, you'd have to apply for the position legitimately, with your own qualifications and references. I won't use my influence to get you hired. Understood. Second, this would be your commitment, not mine. If you come to Costa Rica and decide the work isn't for you, you leave. You don't try to convince me to return to Seattle with you. Agreed. And third, we rebuild our relationship slowly, on equal terms. You don't get to be my protector or my manager. You get to be my son if you can learn what that means as an adult. Marcus nodded solemnly. I'll do whatever it takes to earn that chance. The following week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Harold Peterson negotiated a settlement that included full restitution of fees and lost returns, plus a substantial penalty that would fund the medical education scholarship in my name. Marcus formally withdrew from managing my investments, transferring everything to Patricia Reynolds with written acknowledgement that his previous management had been inadequate. More surprisingly, Victoria asked to meet with me privately. She arrived at my apartment Thursday evening with a bottle of expensive wine and what appeared to be genuine humility. "I owe you an apology that's much more substantial than the one I gave you on the phone," she said, settling onto my couch with unusual informality. "I've spent the last 2 weeks thinking about who I've become, and I don't like what I've discovered." "How so?" "I spent my entire life in social circles, where people's value is measured by their net worth and their connections. I became someone who judges others based on superficial markers instead of character. Watching Marcus dismiss you at our wedding forced me to recognize that I'd been doing the same thing." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "But what really opened my eyes was volunteering at the hospital. I met a mother whose daughter needs the same kind of heart surgery you used to perform. This woman works 3 jobs to support her family, but she speaks about her daughter's surgeon with the same reverence people in my social circle reserve for celebrities." "Medicine creates different kinds of relationships," I observed. "That's what I'm beginning to understand. When Marcus told me about your background, about the surgeries you'd performed and the lives you'd saved, I realized I'd been measuring the wrong things entirely." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. "I wanted to show you something. Remember when you mentioned that your son had been blocking professional opportunities?" I nodded warily. "I asked Marcus to give me access to his email records from the past 3 years. I found 17 separate contacts from medical organizations, hospitals, and international programs trying to reach you. 17 opportunities that I'd never known about, because my son had been managing my image and my options to fit his narrative of what my life should be. The most significant one was from the World Health Organization," Victoria continued. "They wanted to offer you a position developing cardiac surgery protocols for refugee populations. The salary was $250,000, plus housing and travel expenses." The number took my breath away. Not just because of the financial security it would have provided, but because it represented exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd always dreamed of doing. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I want you to understand that Marcus's actions weren't just about family dynamics or financial control. He cost you opportunities to do work that could have affected thousands of lives. The guilt he's carrying isn't just about how he treated you. It's about how his selfishness may have deprived the world of your expertise." It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered. My focus had been on how Marcus's actions had limited my personal opportunities, but Victoria was right about the broader implications. Every surgery I didn't perform, every protocol I didn't develop, every surgeon I didn't train represented lives that might not have been saved. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My father's merger with Marcus's firm fell through today." "Because of the lawsuit?" "Because of me," she said quietly. "I told my father that I couldn't be part of a business relationship built on covering up ethical violations. That if Marcus could treat his own mother so poorly, what would he do to clients who trusted him with their life savings?" The implications of Victoria's decision were enormous. She had chosen ethical principles over financial advantage, potentially costing her family millions of dollars in business opportunities. "What did your father say?" "He was furious at first, but then he said something that surprised me. He said he was proud of me for finally showing some backbone about what really matters." We spent the rest of the evening talking about her volunteer work at the hospital, her growing understanding of healthcare disparities, and her interest in potentially pursuing a career in healthcare administration. By the time she left, I found myself genuinely liking my daughter-in-law for the first time since I'd met her. Saturday morning brought my final appointment with Dr. Patricia Williams and her daughter Sarah. They arrived with a surprise, Dr. Y. Chen from Seattle Medical Center and 3 other prominent surgeons I'd worked with throughout my career. "We wanted to see you off properly," Dr. Chen explained, "and to give you something to take with you to Costa Rica." They presented me with a leather portfolio containing letters of recommendation from dozens of colleagues former patients, and medical administrators who had worked with me over the years. Each letter spoke to different aspects of my career, my character, and my contributions to cardiac surgery. We also wanted you to know, Dr. Williams added, that we've been following the Costa Rica program's development with great interest. Several of us are planning to apply for visiting fellowships to come work with you during your tenure there. The prospect of working alongside colleagues I'd respected throughout my career added another dimension of excitement to the opportunity ahead. Sarah presented me with a scrapbook she'd compiled, documenting not just her own recovery and achievements, but stories from other patients whose lives I'd touched over the years, families who had stayed in contact with Dr. Williams, sending updates about children who had grown up healthy because of surgeries I'd performed. "This is your real legacy," Sarah said, her eyes bright with tears. "Not the lawsuit or the professional setbacks, but the lives you've saved and the difference you've made." As I flipped through the pages, seeing photos of children at graduations, weddings, and birthday parties they might never have experienced without successful heart surgery, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was why I'd become a surgeon, why I'd dedicated my life to medicine, why I was ready to start over at 62 in a foreign country. Sunday evening, Marcus returned with the news I'd been waiting for. Dr. Morrison had agreed to interview him for the administrative position, based on his business credentials and his personal understanding of the program's mission. "The interview is scheduled for tomorrow morning via video call," he said, his nervous energy evident. "I've been preparing all week, researching international healthcare development, studying the financing models for similar programs. And if you don't get the position, then I'll find another way to contribute to international healthcare work," he said firmly. "This isn't just about following you to Costa Rica anymore. It's about doing work that matters, work that helps people instead of just making money." The transformation in my son over the past 2 weeks had been remarkable to witness. The defensive, controlling man who had dismissed me at his wedding had evolved into someone genuinely committed to understanding and supporting my choices. Monday morning, I sat in the airline departure lounge at SeaTac International Airport, my boarding pass for San Jose in hand, and 2 large suitcases containing everything I'd need for my new life. Marcus was 3 gates over, interviewing with Dr. Morrison via laptop, his future as uncertain as mine had been just 3 weeks earlier. Victoria arrived just before my boarding began, carrying a small gift bag and wearing the kind of genuine smile I'd never seen from her before. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," she said, settling into the seat beside me. "And to give you something." The gift was a small silver locket engraved with a medical caduceus on one side and the coordinates of San Jose, Costa Rica on the other. "So you'll always remember where you found yourself again," she explained. "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "And thank you for helping Marcus find his way back to being the son I raised him to be." "He's interviewing well," she reported, glancing toward his gate. "Dr. Morrison seems impressed with his preparation and his understanding of the program's goals. Whatever happens with the job, I think this experience has been good for him." "It's been good for all of us," Victoria agreed. "You standing up for yourself at the wedding forced all of us to examine who we'd become and whether we liked what we saw." As my flight began boarding, I hugged my daughter-in-law goodbye, feeling like I was embracing not just the woman she was, but the person she was still becoming. The flight to Costa Rica gave me 12 hours to reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a diminished woman living in reduced circumstances, dependent on my son's financial management and excluded from his successful life. Today, I was Dr. Margaret Hartwell again, heading toward work that would challenge me, fulfill me, and allow me to save lives on an international scale. More importantly, I'd reclaimed not just my professional identity, but my personal dignity. I'd stopped accepting limitations that others placed on me and started choosing the life I actually wanted to live. As the plane descended toward San Jose, I looked out at the green mountains and bustling city below, feeling not like I was leaving everything behind, but like I was finally arriving where I belonged. Dr. Morrison was waiting at the airport, with a warm smile and a driver to take me to my new apartment. During the ride through the Costa Rican capital, she updated me on recent developments with the program and introduced me to the scope of work that lay ahead. "We have 37 children on our initial surgical list," she explained. "Cases ranging from simple septal defects to complex arterial reconstructions. The local surgical team is excellent, but they're eager to learn the advanced techniques you'll be bringing." As we pulled up to the modern apartment building that would be my home for the next 2 years, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in decades. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of saving children's lives, training the next generation of cardiac surgeons, and building a program that could serve as a model for similar efforts throughout the developing world. My phone buzzed with a text. Message from Marcus. "Got the job. See you in 6 weeks when I arrive for orientation. Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of something important." I smiled, looking out at the mountains surrounding San Jose, knowing that this new chapter would include not just professional fulfillment, but the possibility of rebuilding relationships that had seemed irreparably damaged just weeks earlier. Sometimes the most important victories aren't about proving others wrong, but about proving to yourself that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.